There she is. There she is. The hidden heir.
I didn't do anything wrong.
You were born. For some houses, that is enough. Hide the child.
Sel-Orth, stop this!
A broken heir makes a weak dynasty. Touch her, and you'll learn how deep this garden is buried. You forget your place, old man.
No.
I finally remembered it.
I have been a groundskeeper on the estate of House Vethar for 7 years, and in that time I have come to understand that the most dangerous thing a person in my position can do is be noticed. Not in the way that invites punishment, though that exists too, and I have seen it, but in the other way, the quieter way. The kind where you stop being part of the scenery and start being a person with a perspective. And then someone above you has to decide what to do with that. Once you become a person with a perspective in a house like this, you become a problem. Maybe a small one, but problems get managed, and being managed is its own kind of exhausting. So I kept my head down from the beginning. I kept my route. I kept my tools clean and my hours predictable. And I did the work in the particular way that makes a large man easy to overlook steadily, without urgency, without ever pausing to glance up at the windows. The estate sat on the high plateau of Keth Arsal, which is a word in the Vethar tongue that translates roughly to something like the ground that stands above the argument. I have always thought it was a good name for the place. The plateau was cold in the mornings, cold in the way of places that sit at altitude near open sky, where the air comes off the rock face clean and sharp enough to taste. The sky before sunrise ran deep red, almost arterial, before it opened to amber and then pale gold. The estate itself was built from old pale stone, the kind of construction that belongs to people who have been giving orders for so long they stopped needing to raise their voices about it. Long colonnaded corridors connected the residential wings to the formal ceremonial courts. The garden forecourts were planted with low ornamental shrubs and a variety of grass that turned silver in the wind. It was not an unpleasant place to work. It was a cold one, and a quiet one, and a place with rules that were not always written down but were understood by everyone who lasted more than a season there. I had come to Keth Arsal through a labor transit contract, which is what a man signs when his remaining options are few and the ones he has left are not particularly interesting. I do not say that with bitterness. It is simply accurate. I had spent the better part of 22 years before the Vethar posting working extraction sites, 3 different colony moons across 2 systems, drilling and hauling and managing the particular kind of cold that comes with working underground in places that were never meant for human habitation. The work was honest. The pay was reliable. The people I worked alongside were mostly decent. The problem was not the work itself. The problem was the kind of loneliness that builds in a man who is very good at what he does and has no one to tell about it. Not the sharp loneliness of being alone. I had made my peace with that a long time ago. The other kind. The slow kind. The kind where years pass and you realize that the life you have built is technically complete but does not quite add up to anything you can point at and say, "That was mine." When a commission from the Vethar household came through a contractor I had trusted for a decade, offering a 7-year residential posting on a private estate and asking for someone with experience in stone drainage, cold weather groundswork, and the ability to be left unsupervised, I signed the contract without taking the night to think it over. That was probably a mistake in the technical sense. You should always sleep on a 7-year commitment. But I was 53 years old and I had slept on enough things. And I was tired of the particular flavor of loneliness that came with the extraction sites. You cannot always know what you are walking into until you are already there. I met the child Leah on my 41st morning on the estate. She was in the eastern garden forecourt, a walled garden off the residential wing, quieter than the ceremonial courts, planted with the same silver-turning grass and low stone benches and a central gravel path I raked every 3rd morning. She was sitting in a wheeled frame, a careful construction of pale carved wood and polished alloy, fitted with cushioned forearm rests and a low central seat that kept her upright even when she was still. Her lower limbs did not cooperate with her intentions. This was a congenital condition in the Vethar, the way certain things run in families, except that in a noble house it carried a political weight that a bad back or a short stride never would. She was small. The Vethar children are small even by their own species standards until quite late. And Lisa was young enough that the oversized amber eyes and the fine-pointed ears and the silver-threaded hair that all Vethar children seemed to have were still the most prominent things about her. She was wearing a light robe with a torn hem that someone had mended unevenly, and she was holding a flat stone in both hands, Turning it over and over the way children do with things they have decided are interesting, but have not yet figured out why. She looked at me the way children in households like this look at unfamiliar adults who appear in their spaces not quite afraid, not quite curious, but carefully balanced somewhere between the two. As though she had been told that humans were unpredictable and had decided to wait and collect more data before committing to an opinion. I said good morning in the Vethar fashion, a slight lowering of the chin and the left hand open-palmed, which I had spent my first 3 months on the estate learning well enough not to accidentally cause offense with. She watched me do it. Then she looked back at her stone. I went back to raking the path. On my free 44th morning, she spoke to me. I did not understand what she said. My Vethar at that point was functional for basic courtesies and entirely insufficient for whatever a child that age considers worth saying before the sun has fully risen. I told her as much with my hands, mostly, and with the particular expression of a man indicating that the fault is entirely his own. She watched me for a moment, then held out the flat stone. I took it. I turned it over. It was a piece of pale stone sedimentary, from the look of it, with a vein of darker mineral running through it in a shape that could, if you tilted it toward the light and applied some goodwill, resemble a bird with its wings extended in flight. I held it up so the morning came through the vein. I nodded. I handed it back. She kept it. That was the beginning. Not friendship, she was a child of a noble house. And I was a human groundskeeper whose primary qualification was that I could be trusted to rake gravel without supervision. And those are not conditions that produce friendship on equal terms. But it was something, a daily acknowledgement, a small mutual agreement that the other person existed and was worth a moment of attention in the morning. Over the weeks that followed, it developed the way these things do when two people do not share a common language and both have too much dignity to perform elaborate mime at each other. She would be in the garden when I arrived. I would work my route. She would watch. Or she would be occupied with her own things, drawing on a flat slate with a thin stylus, or sorting small stones she collected from the gravel paths into arrangements on a low wooden tray, or simply sitting with her eyes on the horizon in the particular way that children who spend a great deal of time alone develop. Sometimes I would show her something I was doing, the correct angle for a drainage channel, the way bad mortar crumbles differently from healthy mortar when you press it, the particular grip for trimming the ornamental shrubs so the new growth came back even rather than ragged. She paid attention to all of it with the same quality of focus, filing it away somewhere, into some internal catalog I could not read. She had attendants, nominally, 2 Vethar women who appeared in the garden for certain hours and provided the physical care that I was neither trained nor authorized to offer, and who treated her with a professional competence that was not unkind but was also not warm. They were rotated on a schedule I was not given access to, and the gaps between their appearances were longer than seemed strictly reasonable. During those gaps, the Eastern Garden was Leah's domain, and in the way of children who have become expert at their own company, she filled it. I was not her caretaker. I was not her companion. I was the groundskeeper whose route brought him through the Eastern Garden twice a day, and if I occasionally found reasons to work more slowly on the eastern side of the estate than the western, that was between me and my schedule. She learned my name before I properly learned hers. Or she learned what to call me a sound that took the first syllable of my given name and stretched it, so it came out less like a word and more like a sustained low note. I did not correct her. The second month, I found out through the head steward, framed carefully as a question about Vethar naming customs rather than a question about the child, specifically that her name was Leah, which meant, in the older form of the language, the one who waits. I asked what that meant, in context. He told me it was not an uncommon name for Vethar girls of her position. I did not ask him to clarify what he meant by her position, because by then I had been on the estate long enough to know which questions it was wiser not to finish. In the 5th month I began learning Vethar in earnest. Not from a formal tutor, there was no budget for a groundskeeper's language instruction, and no protocol for requesting one. I learned from a vocabulary primer the steward lent me without comment, and from Leah herself, who had discovered somewhere in the 3rd month that teaching me words she considered important was a satisfying use of the morning hours. The system was this. She would point at something in the garden, a stone, a branch, the sky, the drainage channel, and say the word clearly. Twice, I would repeat it. She would evaluate my pronunciation with an expression of professional assessment that had no business sitting on the face of a child her age. And if I got it wrong, she made a small clipped sound and said it again. If I got it right, she said nothing. I learned quickly that her version of approval was silence. I learned the words for stone: sky, water, cold, morning, work, wait, good, wrong, and try again. I learned the Vithar word for a particular quality of early light the hour before the sky had fully decided what color it would be that day, and because she insisted on this particular one. I learned the word she taught me in the 4th month, a compound term that translates roughly as a person who keeps returning. She pointed at me and said it. I wrote it down that night and looked at it for a while before I went to sleep. At the time, I was not entirely sure whether it was a compliment. The stones were a matter of their own. By the time I was paying close attention, she had accumulated a considerable collection sorted into groupings on that low wooden tray she kept on the bench beside her frame, organized according to a system that was not, as far as I could determine, based on size or color or apparent origin. When I asked her, in my careful early Vethar, what the organizing principle was, she looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has asked them to explain why they put the fork on the left side of the plate. Like the answer should be obvious and the question itself revealed a gap. Then she explained it anyway, patiently, without condescension. The system was what she called, and the steward helped me understand this later, the weight of attention. It was a Vithar concept I did not have a clean equivalent for in my own language. The basic idea was this: some objects, when they enter a space, demand to be noticed immediately. Others do not demand it but reward the person who notices them anyway, over time, with longer looking. Others reveal themselves only when placed next to something else they have no independent statement to make, only a relational one. The flat stone with the bird vein was in the second category. She showed me its place in the tray with the gesture she used for things she had already finished thinking about. I asked, because I was curious and because I had recently learned enough Vethar to ask simple questions, which category I was in. She picked up a stone from the 3rd group, the ones that only mean something in relation to something else, and held it in one hand. She looked at it. She looked at me. Then she moved it to the 2nd group and set it down. I did not ask her to explain. There are things that do not require explanation. They only require that you note them and carry them. I noted it. I carried it. The queen of House Vethar was a woman named Vara. I saw her rarely and at a distance. And what I observed of her, I observed the way you observe the weather on a plateau, as something that shaped conditions without making any announcement about it. She was tall, even for a Vethar, and she moved through the ceremonial parts of the estate the way a change in pressure moves through a room, felt before it is seen, orienting everything around it without asking permission. She wore the house colors, deep teal and silver, without any additional ornament, in the way people dress when ornament would be redundant. She was not a cruel woman. I want to be clear about that, because what comes later in this account might suggest otherwise. And I do not want to suggest otherwise because I do not believe it is true. She was a precise woman, which in a house like this amounts to much the same practical effect as cruelty in certain situations, not because precision is cruel, but because precision applied to a child's daily life can cut as cleanly as anything else. She loved Leah. I believe that without reservation. Even now, the evidence was in the child herself. Children who have not been loved carry it in how they hold their bodies in a specific quality of flinching readiness, a learned smallness, a way of moving that is always slightly anticipatory, always slightly braced. Leah did not move like that. She was guarded, and she was self-sufficient, and she had the particular composure of a child who has spent too many hours alone. But she did not flinch. She knew she was loved. What she also knew, and this is harder to name, though I thought about it often in the early mornings before my route began, was that she was the thing about which the most powerful person in her world felt something genuinely complicated, something that did not resolve neatly, something that the powerful person managed, with precision, rather than simply lived with. That is a heavier weight than not being loved. Not being loved, you can eventually set down. Complicated love keeps its grip. It has no clean edge. It is simply there, and it is heavy. And the child carries it in the particular self-sufficiency of a person who has learned not to require more than she is going to be given. I did not say any of this to anyone. I was a groundskeeper. I raked gravel and cleared drainage channels. These were not my thoughts to act on, but I kept showing up every morning at the same hour, on the same route, and she was there. And that was what there was. By the 6th month, I could hold a real conversation in Vethar, provided both parties were willing to work at it and neither of us was in a hurry. My pronunciation still made Leah produce the small clipped sound of professional disapproval on certain vowel combinations. and my grammar ran about 2 beats behind where I wanted it, but I could manage a sentence. I could ask questions and understand the answers if they came slowly enough. What I had not expected was how much the language would change what I could see. There is a version of a place that you occupy when you work in it without speaking its language. You understand the physical layout, the schedules, the hierarchies of function, who gives orders, who carries them out, what the acceptable pace of each task is. You understand the place the way you understand a machine, by its outputs and its patterns. But the language is something else. The language gives you access to the texture of a place, the things people say when they are not being official about it, the particular phrasings that carry more information than their surface meaning, the gaps between what is said and what is meant, which in a house like this were often the most informative spaces of all. I learned all of this slowly, over months, in the way you learn things when no one is teaching you deliberately, through accumulation, through pattern recognition, through mistakes made and quietly noted. I made enough mistakes in my early Vethar that I became, in certain quarters, a figure of mild amusement. I did not object to that. Mild amusement is a safe register to occupy. You are not a threat when you are slightly ridiculous in someone's second language. Leah found my errors instructive in a different way. She had a method. When I said something incorrectly in a way that could be corrected with a single substitution, she would say the correct version back to me and wait until I had repeated it. When I said something that required a more structural repair, she would pause, look at me with the expression of a teacher confronting a truly ambitious misunderstanding, and then model the sentence from the beginning. She never expressed impatience. She was 7, or the Vethar equivalent of 7, and she had more patience for genuine effort than most adults I had known. I had noticed, by the 6th month, that the drawings on her slate had changed. In the early weeks, she had drawn what seemed to be abstract arrangements, patterns of line and curve that I could not map onto anything representational. By the 3rd month, the drawings had become more figurative. The garden walls, the silver grass in wind, the stone bench. By the 6th month, she had gone back to the flat stone with the bird vein. But the bird in the drawing was no longer the suggestion of a shape that required goodwill to read. The wings were clear, extended. The bird in flight was now unambiguous. I looked at it one morning and then pointed at the original stone in its tray and then back at the drawing and nodded. She made the small sound of near agreement that served her as a shrug, which I understood by then to mean, it is close, but not finished yet. I did not ask what it needed. Some things you do not need to ask. The delegation from the Keth Consortium arrived on a cold morning early in the 3rd month of the cold season. There were 14 of them, which was more than I had seen arrive together in 7 years on the estate. They came in a formal transport that landed on the upper forecourt, and the Queen's full household chamberlain staff turned out to receive them with a degree of ceremony that told me immediately this was not a routine diplomatic courtesy. I found out the details later, pieced together from the steward's careful half-sentences and the things that circulate in a kitchen when people forget to lower their voices. The Keth Consortium was seeking a territorial compact that would restructure transit rights through 3 outer plateau corridors, and the negotiation was expected to run for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer if the specific provisions required significant revision. The consortium's lead envoy was a man named Selorth. I never spoke to him directly and did not want to. He was not a tall man, but he occupied space the way people do who have not spent a significant portion of their lives navigating other people's authority comfortably, expansively, with the assumption that the space he occupied was his by right. He wore formal consortium colors, a deep gray-green, and he moved through the estate's ceremonial areas with the particular ease of a man who has been welcomed into many important rooms and has never once doubted that he belonged in all of them. I noticed him twice in passing. Both times he did not notice me at all. The first thing that changed after the delegation arrived was the staffing in the Eastern Garden. 3 days in, both of Leah's regular attendants were pulled to support the expanded service requirements of the Chamberlain's household during the delegation's stay. This was not announced as a permanent change. Nothing in a house like this is announced as permanent when it can instead be framed as a temporary accommodation. A single replacement attendant was assigned a woman I had not seen before on the estate, who appeared twice a day for the minimum required care and otherwise left. The gap in the Eastern Garden stretched longer than it had before. I noticed this not because I was tracking it deliberately, but because I tracked all patterns on the estate. The way a person who has worked the same ground for 7 years tracks patterns, by feel, by the small wrongness of deviation. The The quality of the silence in the garden was different when the gap was long. Leah was different in it, not visibly distressed, not in any way that would read as a complaint, but quieter. The drawings were smaller. The sorting of stones was slower. The second thing that changed came through the household hierarchy, in the way orders do when the people giving them would prefer not to have said them aloud. It reached me through the head steward. On a morning about a week after the delegation arrived, he delivered it in the way he delivered things he did not entirely endorse carefully, in the passive voice, reading from a document that was not physically present. Service staff whose routes were not specifically required in the Eastern Garden forecourt were encouraged to redirect their work to other areas of the estate for the duration of the delegation's visit, in order to preserve the residential character of that space. I said I understood. I did not change my route. I want to be precise about this because I have thought about it many times since, and I would not want anyone to read into it something that was not there. I was not making a statement. I was not taking a stand or performing deliberate defiance. I was a groundskeeper, and the drainage channels behind the east terrace wall needed to be cleared on the schedule I had maintained for 7 years, and the ornamental shrubs along the eastern colonnade needed trimming on the schedule I had maintained for 7 years, and the gravel path through the eastern forecourt needed raking on the schedule I had maintained for 7 years. The order that had come down through the steward was phrased as encouragement rather than instruction, and it had arrived through an intermediary rather than directly from the chamberlain, with the full weight of the household behind it. In 7 years on this estate, I had learned to know the difference between a hard order and a soft one. This was a soft one. It had given it. The kind of give that is, in fact, an acknowledgement that the person giving the instruction knows it is not entirely defensible. The work needed doing. I went and did it. On the 8th morning after the delegation arrived, Leah was in her frame when I reached the garden, sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. When she heard the gate latch, she turned her head with the controlled restraint of someone who had decided not to appear to be waiting. When she saw it was me, something in the line of her shoulders shifted. Not much. Enough. I said good morning in the Vether fashion. I went to the drainage channel. I worked. She watched for a while in silence and then picked up her stylus and began to draw. And the ordinary rhythm of the morning reasserted itself the way ordinary rhythms do when nothing has officially changed. Before I left, I crouched by her frame and looked at what she was drawing. The bird again. But different now, the wings adjusted. One slightly higher than the other. The body angled forward. She had been working on the question of motion. How a thing in flight is not symmetrical, is not posed, is caught in a specific instant of its own momentum. I pointed at the drawing and put my thumb up. My Vethar was adequate, for this is good work in a general sense, but not for what I actually meant, which was something more like, you are solving the right problem. There is a difference, and I knew she would know the difference, so I did not try to paper over it with words I did not quite have. She looked at the drawing, then back at me, and made the small sound, the near snort of amused disagreement, which meant she had opinions about the drawing's quality that she was keeping to herself, partly because she knew it was not finished and partly because she was, underneath everything, a little pleased. I went back through the gate and finished my route. This continued for a week. What I was learning during that week, in pieces, through the things the steward told me carefully and the things the kitchen workers said less carefully, was the shape of what had happened. Selorth had made a remark, not a demand, a remark, framed as a concern from a party invested in the success of the compact, in the interests of the house's long-term standing with the consortium. The remark had concerned the presence, in the residential and ceremonial spaces of the estate, of a child with a visible mobility impairment, and the impression this created for a delegation in the process of evaluating the strength and continuity of the house. It had been framed, the steward told me later, with great care, no raised voice, no explicit threat, no record of having been said in any formal capacity. It was the most efficient form that pressure takes in environments like this one, the form that leaves no evidence of itself because it does not need to. The Queen had not issued a direct order about Leah. What she had done was said nothing in response to the remark. And in a house of this kind, the absence of a protective statement is its own kind of instruction. The staff understood. The staffing rotation changed. The soft suggestion to redirect routes away from the Eastern Garden circulated. Nobody had said, keep the child out of sight. Nobody had needed to. On the 11th morning after the delegation arrived, it rained. Not a cold rain. The plateau's rains in this part of the cold season were warm and heavy. the kind that came in off the southern shelf in walls of gray and left everything clean and silver afterward. I had arrived at the estate gate before the rain started and worked through the first part of my morning quickly. By the time I reached the eastern garden, the rain was coming down in earnest. Leah was there. She was in her frame in the middle of the garden forecourt, in the rain, because no one had thought to bring her inside. She was not distressed. That is the first thing I want to say. She was sitting in her frame, with her face tilted slightly upward and her eyes open, and the rain coming through her silver-threaded hair. And her expression was not misery or fear or even particular discomfort. It was alert. It was the specific attentiveness of a child encountering something that falls outside normal parameters and is taking careful inventory of it before committing to a feeling about it. I crossed the garden at a pace that was not a run, because I have found that the most useful thing a large person can do in proximity to a child who might be startled is move without urgency. She was not in danger. She was wet, and the rain was warm, and she was entirely capable of thinking about it for herself. I crouched by the frame. I said her name once in the Vethar way. She looked at me. Her expression shifted into the weighing look I had come to know, the look of a person deciding how much trust a situation warrants. I took off my work coat. It was a heavy canvas thing, lined, the kind of coat designed for spending long hours in wind and cold, and I draped it over the frame's canopy struts in a way that made a rough shelter across her head and shoulders. It was not elegant construction. The coat sagged in the middle and the rain came in at the sides if the wind shifted, but it worked in the general sense of being better than nothing. She looked up at it. She looked at me. She made the small sound, the almost snort. The amusement she did not quite commit to, and said something in a tone that needed no translation. She was pointing out, clearly and without particular sympathy, that I was now getting wet. I said, "In Vethar, I know." I stayed. She did not lean toward me. She was a child of a noble house, and I was the groundskeeper, and we both understood certain distances. But she sat inside the shelter of my coat, and I crouched beside the frame in the rain, and we waited out the worst of it together. When the rain eased to a drizzle, I wheeled her frame under the covered colonnade at the garden's eastern edge, where the overhang was deep enough to keep her dry. I propped the garden gate open so she could see the court, and I went back to do the work I had come to do. When I was preparing to leave, she stopped me. She held out the flat stone, the pale sedimentary stone with the dark mineral vein with both hands, in the formal Vethar gesture of gift-giving, which requires both hands and a specific quality of stillness in the arms that communicates the offering has been considered, and the decision has been made. And this is not an impulsive thing. I took it, I turned it over once in my hands. I felt the vein under my thumb, the dark line that became a bird if you held it toward the light at the right angle. I put it in the chest pocket of my work coat and pressed the pocket flat with my palm. She watched me do this. Her expression was the one she used when something had been resolved to her satisfaction, not triumphant, not sentimental, just settled. I said thank you in Vethar. She said nothing, which I had learned by then was her version of you are welcome. I carried that stone every day after that. 2 days after the rain, on a late afternoon, when the light across the mesa had gone from gold to copper and the wind had dropped enough that the silver grass stood still for the first time in a week, I finished the drainage work on the eastern wall faster than expected and found I was not in a hurry to leave. Leah was in the center of the forecourt in her frame, slate on her lap, stylus in hand. She'd been drawing. But when I straightened up from the drainage channel and turned to begin on the shrubs, she had set the stylus down and was watching me with the expression I had come to know well over the past several months, the expression of a person with a complicated thought and insufficient shared vocabulary to communicate it, who is working out whether the attempt is worth the effort. I had learned to wait when she wore that expression, to keep doing whatever I was doing, or to slow down, but not to prompt her or fill the silence with something easier. She would get there, or she would not. And either way, the waiting was the right thing. She got there. She pointed at my feet. I stopped. I looked at my feet, then at her, and waited. She made a gesture with her hands, both of them, a slow, deliberate motion, side to side, like something rocking. And then she pointed at my feet again. It took me a moment to parse it. She had been watching me walk for months. Not the way you watch someone move from place to place. She had watched the weight of it, the way I shifted from foot to foot when I was working, the way my body committed to one side and then recovered toward the other. She had been watching the physics underneath the motion, and she had accumulated enough observations to generate a question about what it looked like when a person moved their feet on purpose, not to get somewhere, for some other reason. I could have explained that I was not a dancer. That was true. I was a 56-year-old groundskeeper with a bad left shoulder and a preference for practical footwear, and the word dancer was not one I would have applied to myself in any context. But my mother had been a dancer, or more precisely, my mother had been a small woman from a coastal town who believed that knowing how to move your body intentionally was a basic form of literacy, in the same category as knowing how to read a compass or gut a fish or say please and thank you in 4 languages. She had insisted that her son learn the basic patterns on the grounds that a person who could not move their feet on purpose was missing something the world would eventually require of them. She had not been wrong. She was rarely wrong about that kind of thing. So I knew the basic patterns. They lived in my legs rather than in my head, the kind of knowledge that gets stored in the body when it is learned early enough and practiced enough that it becomes automatic, below the level of thought. I had not used them in a long time. I had not had occasion to, but they were there. The way certain things remain with you, regardless of how little use you have made of them. I looked at Leah. I looked at the flat open space of the forecourt. I thought about it for a few seconds. Not long. The thinking was not complicated. I showed her the first pattern, just the feet, just the weight shift. A simple rocking motion my mother had called the fjord step, because the rhythm of it matched the movement of a small boat on calm water. The body commits forward onto the left, holds for a breath, then lifts back through center and presses right, holds, comes back. It is not dramatic. It is almost absurdly plain when you are doing it alone on a gravel forecourt on an alien plateau in the late afternoon of a cold season. But the rhythm of it is real, and it is the foundation everything else is built from. And my mother had been very firm about starting with the foundation. I did it slowly. I did it 3 times through. Leah watched with her whole body. Her head was still. Her eyes tracked each shift of weight exactly. But she was not watching the way you watch something unfamiliar and trying to categorize it. She was watching the way she watched things. She was trying to understand from the inside. The logic underneath the motion. The commitment of the body to one side and the recovery back through center. She was filing it away not as information about what I was doing, but as information about how it worked. Then she put her hands out toward me. I understood what she was asking. I want to be honest about what I felt in the moment before I answered, because honesty seems important here. And what I felt was a brief, complicated calculation, not about whether to do it, but about how. She was a child of a noble house, and I was a groundskeeper, and the Eastern Garden forecourt was not a private space, technically, even in the late afternoon. The calculation lasted about 2 seconds. At the end of it, I reached out and offered both forearms the V-Thar gesture that means, "Hold here, I have you." She gripped my forearms with both hands. Her grip was stronger than I expected. The Vethar are built differently from humans in certain ways that are not immediately visible, and strength in the upper body is one of them, particularly in children who have used their arms for mobility and leverage since they were small. I adjusted my stance to account for it, shifting my weight back slightly to take the change in balance. I took the weight of the frame's forward axis in my own center of gravity and found the balance between us. And then I did the pattern again, not looking at my feet, looking at her face. The frame rolled slightly on the gravel as I shifted my weight, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The front wheels lifting just enough to let the shift travel through the frame's structure and into her forearms, and from her forearms into her body. I felt the moment she understood what was happening. Her grip changed, not tighter, but different, more certain, less like holding on and more like participating. She was in the rhythm, not doing the footwork. That was not the point, and she knew it was not the point. The point was the transfer of the thing through the contact. The way the cadence travels from a person's legs into their torso and through their arms and into whatever they are in contact with. My mother had taught me that on the dock in Bodo with a rope tied to a railing, making me feel the rhythm through the rope before she let me try it in my own body. The principle was the same. We did it 3 times through. On the 3rd pass, she exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind that comes out of a person when something resolves. When a theory that has been running for a long time is finally confirmed. She let go. She settled back in the frame. She looked at me with an expression I did not have a category for, not the weighing expression, not the professional assessment expression, not the near amusement expression. Something else, something I would have called, if I had been forced to name it, the expression of a person who has just learned something they expected to be smaller than it was. I straightened up. My left shoulder reminded me that I was 56 and had spent the afternoon clearing drainage channels in the cold. I said in Vethar, "Good." She looked at me. Then she said the word she had taught me in the 4th month, the compound term, the one that translated as a person who keeps returning. But she said it in a particular tone that I had enough context by then to understand. Not a description. Something closer to a name. Something she had decided. I said yes. I suppose that was right. I did not know, at that moment, that the Queen had been on the observation terrace. The observation terrace ran along the upper level of the residential wing, directly overlooking the eastern garden forecourt. It was set back behind a carved stone balustrade in the Vithar style, visible from the garden if you were looking for it, invisible if you were not. I had worked that garden for 7 years and had looked up at the terrace perhaps twice in all that time, because it was none of my business, and I had been, from the beginning, a person who did not look at things that were none of his business. I was not looking up at it that afternoon. I did not know anyone was there. The steward told me later, in the careful way he had of relaying things that would not appear in any household record, that the Queen had gone to the terrace that afternoon to take a few minutes of quiet, that she had been there for some time before I arrived to finish my afternoon route, that she had watched all of it, the exchange with the slate, the way I had waited out her expression, the patterns and the forearms and the frame rolling slightly on the gravel with the rhythm and, most specifically, Leah's face. She had said nothing while she was there. She was not a woman who spoke before she had finished thinking. She watched, and when there was nothing more to watch, she came back inside. What the steward told me later, weeks later, in pieces, was this: when the Queen came off the terrace that afternoon, she dismissed the 2 household staff members who were waiting in the corridor outside her private receiving room, and she went in alone. And she was in there for 2 hours. What happened in those 2 hours was not told to me, and I did not ask. What he told me was the outcome, which was visible in how she came out of the room. He had served in this house for 30 years. He could read it the way a person reads weather on a landscape they have known for a long time, not by any single sign, but by the quality of everything at once. She came out with the stillness of a person who has made a decision they are not going to revisit. The following morning, I arrived at the estate and went about my route. The morning was cold, in the way the plateau mornings were cold at this point in the season. The red light came up over the eastern ridge. The silver grass stood still. The stone of the palace walls was pale and clean and very old. I worked the north colonnade first, then the western court drainage, then moved toward the eastern garden. When I reached the gate, I found them both there. The Queen was sitting on the stone bench at the garden's western edge. The bench I had always assumed was decorative because in 7 years I had never seen anyone use it. She was wearing her house colors, deep teal and silver, without any additional ornament, and she was sitting with her hands in her lap, and her posture the posture of a person who is making themselves available rather than occupying a position of authority. She was not holding court. She was simply there, in the garden, in the cold morning, on the stone bench. Leah was in her frame, about 2 meters away, with her slate across her forearms. She was not drawing. She was looking at her mother with the careful, weighted expression I knew well. The expression of a person who has been careful for a long time, deciding whether the situation warrants being less careful. I stopped at the gate. The steward appeared behind me. "Moving quietly," he said, in a low voice. "The groundskeeper's work in the eastern garden is not required this morning," I said in an equally low voice. "The drainage channel on the east wall needs checking after the rain earlier this week." He looked at me. We both understood that this was not, technically, about the drainage channel. He also understood what I understood, which was that the groundskeeper's presence in this garden had been, in some way that was hard to articulate precisely, part of the mechanism by which something had been happening here, something that the Queen had now decided she wanted to continue. Removing the mechanism at this particular moment seemed likely to be counterproductive. He was a man who had spent 30 years navigating the gap between what was said and what was meant in a house that ran almost entirely on the distance between those two things. He ran the calculation. It took him approximately 3 seconds. He said, "Of course. Carry on." I went through the gate. I walked to the east wall. I crouched down and inspected the drainage channel, which did in fact have some debris accumulation from the rain. I began to clear it. I kept my back to the garden. Behind me, the morning was quiet in the way of something that contains more than the absence of sound. I was aware of all of it without looking at any of it. They were not speaking. Not at first. The silence between them was not empty, it had a quality to it. The density of two people feeling their way toward the same space from different directions, and neither of them quite ready to announce they had arrived. After some time, I heard a sound I did not at first recognize. It was low, sustained, a single pitch held for the length of a slow breath, and then a second pitch slightly below it, and then the first again. Vethar, but not words, the kind of Vethar that exist before or below language, in the register of pitch rather than the register of meaning. A humming, very quiet. The Queen was providing music, because it had not occurred to anyone else to provide music, and possibly because it had not occurred to her before this morning either, and she had decided that the absence of it was something she could address. I did not look. I kept working. I found 2 more places in the channel that needed clearing, and I cleared them with the particular deliberateness of a man who is absolutely focused on his drainage work and thinking about nothing else whatsoever. When I finished the channel, I moved to the shrubs along the eastern wall. I could hear, without looking, the subtle change in what was happening behind me. The frame's wheels had moved on the gravel, the sound I knew, and they had moved toward the bench. Then I heard the Queen's voice change register from pitch to something approaching words. Low, slow. The cadence of it uncertain in the particular way that cadences are uncertain when someone is choosing their words carefully, not because they do not know what to say, but because they understand that the saying of it has not been easy, and they want to get it right. I kept trimming. I was a groundskeeper. I had been doing this work for 7 years. I knew what a private moment looked like from behind, and I knew how to be behind it without being in it, and that was where I stayed. The steward began telling me things in the days that followed. Not all at once. He was not a man who delivered information in a single organized transmission. He told it the way he told everything that was not going to appear in any official household record, in pieces, over several days, at moments that seemed incidental, in the manner of a man passing you in a corridor and saying something that happens to be relevant and then continuing on his way. You had to assemble it yourself. He trusted you to do that, or he would not have told you any of it. What I assembled was this. The morning after the Queen had sat on the stone bench in the Eastern Garden, she had canceled 2 hours of the formal delegation schedule. The official reason recorded in the household session logs was a residential protocol review, which was a phrase that could mean almost anything and which, in this case, meant that the Queen had decided there was something more important to attend to. The delegation staff were informed through the Chamberlain's office. Selorth received the notification with the neutrality that the steward, who had been present, described as studied. The following session, the Queen had introduced a proposed addendum to the Territorial Compact, a single clause. It concerned the rights of all persons with congenital mobility conditions traveling through or residing in any territory covered by the Compact's provisions, the right to full access, full accommodation, and legal standing equivalent to any other Compact citizen. The clause was detailed. It was clearly not improvised. It had been drafted by someone who had been thinking about the specific language for some time and had been waiting for the right moment to introduce it. Selorth had received this proposal with the particular stillness of a man who understands that the negotiation has shifted in a direction he cannot easily address without revealing something he would prefer not to reveal. He could not oppose the clause on practical grounds without the practical grounds becoming the story. He could not object to the principle without the objection to the principle becoming the story. He could delay, or he could introduce revisions that softened the language at the edges, which he did 3 revisions, all accepted by the Queen's legal staff with minor counter-adjustments, and then there was nothing left to do but adopt the clause. It was adopted on the 2nd day after it was introduced. Selorth departed the estate 1 day ahead of the planned schedule. The reason recorded in the household log was a scheduling conflict with a prior commitment. The steward told me this with the careful absence of expression he maintained when describing things that required him to be precise without editorializing. The compact was signed on the morning of the delegation's final official day. The Queen signed it herself, which she did not always do for agreements of this kind. She signed it without reading it again first, which meant she had already read it enough times that she did not need to. The changes to Leah's daily arrangements were implemented within the week. Both of the attendants who had been reassigned to delegation support were not reassigned back to Leah's care rotation. The Queen had reviewed the care arrangements personally, not through the household chamberlain, not through a delegated administrative staff member, but personally, herself in her own time, and had selected 2 attendants. The selection criteria were not announced. The result was 2 women who had a different quality of attention from the previous rotation. I cannot say exactly what the difference was. I am a groundskeeper, not a child welfare specialist, but I noticed it within a week, in the way I noticed all things on the estate, by feel, by the texture of how patterns ran. The Eastern Garden had a different quality to it in the hours when these two women were present. Less functional, more inhabited. There was more voice in it. The new rotation was fixed and permanent. No redistribution to household service during delegation visits or ceremonial events. The steward told me this with the particular precision he reserved for things that had been made unambiguous, as distinct from things that were understood but not formalized. This had been made unambiguous. It was in writing, in the household administrative records, authorized by the Queen. I asked him, in the careful way I had learned to ask things, whether the change had come with any explanation attached. He said the authorization simply stated that the Eastern Residential Garden required consistent attendant coverage and that the previous arrangement had been inadequate to that requirement. He said it was in the Queen's own hand. I said, I see. He said, yes. We both left it at that. Approximately 2 weeks after the delegation left, there was a note in the groundskeeping department's service logbook. The note was brief, 3 sentences. It authorized the Eastern Garden forecourt to receive full standard maintenance service without alteration or interruption for the remainder of the estate's operational period. It specified that this authorization superseded any temporary or standing instructions to the contrary that might be issued by household staff below the level of the Queen's direct household. It was not addressed to me specifically in authorization. Addressed to me specifically would have created a formal record requiring acknowledgement and sign-off from several layers of household administration, each of which would have had the opportunity to generate opinions about it. It was addressed to the groundskeeping department's service record. It was in the Queen's own hand. The note is still in the logbook. I have kept my route, the steward also told me, because he was a complete information kind of man, that the Queen had been in the Eastern Garden on 4 mornings in the 3 weeks after the delegation left. Not every morning. She had a household to run, a territorial compact to begin implementing, a set of political relationships to manage in the wake of a negotiation that had not ended exactly as one of the parties had anticipated. 4 mornings in 3 weeks was what the schedule allowed. On 2 of those mornings they had spoken conversations the steward was not present for, and did not characterize further than to say that they had happened. On 1 morning the Queen had brought something with her, a small item wrapped in cloth that she had left with Leah when she went back inside. On the 4th morning, neither of them had spoken at all. The Queen had simply sat on the stone bench and Leah had been in her frame nearby. And the morning had come in over the ridge in the way it always did, rid going to amber, going to pale gold, and they had both been in it. I was not present for those 4 mornings. My route took me through the Eastern Garden twice a day. And after the steward told me that the Queen was coming to the garden in the mornings, I adjusted my timing, not dramatically, not in a way that would be legible to anyone running an eye over the logbook. But I found that the morning work in the Eastern Garden ran better, for a few weeks, if I came through it at the earlier end of the range. The time the Queen came through it was closer to the middle, so I came at the earlier end, and by the time she arrived I had finished and moved on. And the garden was tidy and ready and I was somewhere else. Some things do not need a groundskeeper present to proceed. Some things proceed better without one. What I thought about, in the evenings of those weeks, was the shape of what had happened when I was not overthinking it. I had shown up every morning, on the same route, through the same gate, to the same garden. I had done the work. I had raked the path and cleared the drains and trimmed the shrubs and crouched in the rain with a canvas coat draped over a wheeled frame. And I had held out both forearms and let the rhythm travel through the contact. And I had been precisely where I was supposed to be at every moment of it. None of that was strategic. I want to be firm about that. I did not know the Queen was on the terrace. I did not know that the stone with the bird vane would become a gift, or that the rain would come on the 11th morning, or that the word Leah had taught me in the 4th month would still be in my chest 7 months later, polished smooth from handling. I showed up. I did my work. I kept my route. What I had not expected, when I signed the labor transit contract on the same afternoon it arrived, was that showing up and doing work could accumulate into something. I do not mean something grand. I mean something specific. The specific weight of a flat stone in a chest pocket. The specific quality of a child's grip on a forearm when the rhythm is passing through the contact and she stops anticipating the next step and starts feeling it. The specific sound of the Queen's voice-changing registers on a cold morning in a walled garden, from something without words to something that was trying to find them. These were small things. I had no illusions about their scale. Against the territorial compact and the transit corridors and the political stakes of the Keth Consortium's visit, What I had done amounted to showing up in a garden and doing my job and not adjusting my route when a soft suggestion had come down through the household that I might redirect it. But the small things were real. I had seen their reality in the quality of the silence on those mornings in the garden, in the weight of what the steward did not say while telling me exactly what he needed me to know. In the note, 3 sentences in the Queen's own hand, sitting in the groundskeeping logbook like a stone in the second category, the kind that rewards the person who looks at it for a long time. There was a thing the steward told me, in the 3rd week after the delegation left, that I have thought about often enough that I want to set it down precisely. He came to the depot on a morning when I was sorting tools before the route. He told me that the Queen had been reviewing the household's administrative records from the period of the delegation's stay, that she had reviewed, among other things, the instruction that had been passed through him to service staff regarding the redirection of routes away from the Eastern Garden forecourt, that she had noted the dates on which the groundskeeping log showed the Eastern Garden to have received its standard scheduled maintenance during that period. He stopped there. I waited, he said. She did not issue any comment on those entries. I said, "All right," he said. "I thought you should know that she reviewed them." I said, "I understand. Thank you." He nodded and went back down the depot path in the unhurried way he moved when he had done what he came to do. There was nothing in what he had told me that required a response. The Queen had looked at the records. She had seen that the drainage channels and the shrubs and the gravel path had been serviced on their standard schedule throughout the delegation's stay. She had not commented on this in any official capacity. She had simply looked at the record and noted what it contained and said nothing. In a house that ran almost entirely on the content of what was not said, I understood what the nothing meant. The last thing the steward told me, at the end of that 4th week, was the thing I turned over most in the evenings afterward. He told me that on the evening of the day I had held out my forearms in the forecourt, the Queen had sent a message to the household physician's records office requesting a specific file. The file was a summary of Leah's congenital condition, its medical profile, its standard management approaches, its implications for mobility and physical development over the coming years. It was not a new file. It had been in the records since Leah was born. What was different was the annotation the records office had added to the retrieval entry, noting the date and the reason given. The reason given, in the Queen's own notation, was a single phrase. The steward told me the phrase. He translated it for me carefully. It meant something close to, for purposes of planning. I sat with that for a while after he left. Not planning in the sense of management, the managing of a situation, the organizing of a child's days around the inconveniences of her condition, the other kind of planning, the kind that begins with understanding what the situation actually is, fully, without mitigation, with the intention of building something around it rather than around the idea of what it might someday not be. The distinction is not a small one. It is, in fact, the largest distinction there is. In the lives of people who have conditions that other people spend a great deal of energy hoping will resolve differently. The difference between a life that is being managed until something changes and a life that is being built as it is, starting from what is actually there. I do not know if the Queen had fully understood that distinction before the afternoon on the terrace. I do not know what she saw in Leah's face when the rhythm was passing through the contact and Leah stopped anticipating the next step and started feeling it. I was not there to see what she saw. I was facing the other direction, focused on the pattern. But she had looked at the file that evening, for purposes of planning, and the planning, from what I could observe in the weeks that followed, was underway. This is not a thing I had done. Exactly, but it is a thing I had been present for. And presence, I was learning, is not nothing. Presence has mass. Presence moves through things the way rhythm moves through contact, not always visible, not always audible, but felt by whatever it passes into. I noted that. I carried it. I went back to work. 3 weeks after the delegation left, I was in the Eastern Garden at my regular morning hour, working the shrubs along the east wall. The cold season had settled in fully by then. The silver grass had gone dormant and lay flat against the ground in the pale early light. And the frost preparation I had done the week before had held through the first hard freeze without any of the issues I had been watching for. The sky above the mesa was clear and very blue, a blue that only appears at altitude in cold air, a blue that is almost aggressive in its clarity, and the palace stone was bone pale against it. Leah was in the center of the forecourt in her frame. She had her slate across her forearms and her stylus in hand. She was drawing. I could hear the faint scrape of the stylus on the stone surface, a sound I had filed alongside the wheel sound on the gravel, and the weight shift in the seat, as sounds that meant she was present and occupied, and everything was as it should be. I worked the first section of the east wall shrubs. The frost had stiffened the outer growth in a way that made the trimming slightly different from the warm season work. The branches came away more cleanly, less flecks in them, which was better in one sense and required more care in another, because you could take too much if you were not paying attention. I was paying attention. 7 years of this work had made the attention automatic rather than effortful, which left the thinking part of my mind available for other things. And the thinking part of my mind was, as usual in those weeks, moving through the recent past at its own pace. I was partway through the second section when she called across the garden. She used the sustained note she had always used for my name, the extended version of the first syllable, held for a breath, more pitch than word. I had been hearing it for months, and it had never stopped being exactly right for what it was. A thing she had made from the material she had available. A thing that was specific to me in a way that my actual name was not. Because my actual name was shared by other people in the world, and this version was not. I looked up. She was holding the slate out toward me, both hands, flat, so I could see the surface from across the forecourt. I set down the trimming tool and walked over. She had drawn 2 figures. The first was the frame clearly rendered, the wheels and the forearm rests in the seat. The proportions right in the way her drawings had gotten, right over months of looking closely at the things she inhabited every day. She knew that frame the way I knew my tools, from the inside out, from long acquaintance, from the accumulated knowledge of what it felt like to use it rather than what it looked like to observe it. The second figure was upright, standing, roughly human in proportion: 2 legs, 2 arms, a head but without any specific features, without any attempt at likeness. The proportions were the thing she had gotten right. A person who carries weight, who works with their body, whose center of gravity is low, and whose stance is wide, and whose arms hang slightly forward from the shoulder the way arms do on a person who has spent years reaching and lifting and working at ground level. It did not look like me in any specific way. It looked exactly like me in every way that mattered. Between the 2 figures she had drawn lines, not a grip. Exactly. Not the formal Vethar forearm gesture I had offered her in the forecourt on the afternoon of the dancing. Something that suggested connection without specifying its form lines that moved between the 2 figures in a way that implied the transfer of something, weight or rhythm, or both. The kind of connection that has a physical component and something else that the physical component is carrying. Underneath the 2 figures, in careful Vethar characters that were clearly and deliberately formed, the kind of deliberate formation that means a person has thought about each stroke before making it. She had written 2 words. I looked at them. My Vethar reading was significantly behind my Vethar speaking, and I could not parse them quickly enough to be certain I had them right. I noted the shapes carefully. I stayed with the drawing for a long moment, long enough to mean it, which is what she had taught me about the second category of stones. Then I handed the slate back. She took it. She looked at me with the settled expression, the expression of something resolved. I said, "In Vethar, I will ask Koriev." She nodded once, as though this had been the expected answer. I went back to the shrubs. She went back to whatever she was doing with the drawing after the fact. The morning continued. The blue sky deepened as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The frost on the gravel path caught the light and held it for a little while before the warmth of the sun began to work on it. When I finished the east wall, I completed the rest of the route and went to find Koriev. The head steward's name was Koriev. I had been calling him the steward for so long in my own thinking that I want to use his actual name here, because this particular conversation was his in a way that the earlier ones had not quite been. The earlier conversations had been him transmitting information. This one was different. I found him in the corridor outside the household records room. I showed him the shapes I had copied onto a page from my own notebook, the 2 Vethar character groups, reproduced as carefully as I could manage from memory. He took the notebook and looked at them for a moment. Then he was quiet, not the quiet of a man consulting his vocabulary, the quiet of a man who understood what he was looking at and was deciding how to say it. He said, "The first word is the common form for teacher. The word used when someone has transmitted a skill or a way of doing something, not the formal pedagogical term, but the word used between people for whom the transmission was direct and personal. The word that means the person who showed you rather than the person who instructed you." I said, "And the second?" He said, "The second is more complicated." He said it slowly. He said it was a compound form built from a root that had to do with shared motion, not motion alongside each other, but motion that is constituted by 2 things together. motion that would not exist in the same form without both of them. He said the specific construction she had used placed it in the context of physical rhythm, of two bodies finding the same cadence. He said that in modern Vithar, the compound was used most commonly in the context of dancing the partner, the one you dance with, but that the older root of it was broader. And what the older root described was not the dancing specifically, but the effect of the dancing on the body. He paused here. He said he was going to translate it as precisely as he could, and that the precision would make it sound more formal than it was in the Vethar, which was not formal at all, but was a word that a child her age would use without self-consciousness, he said, together, in the construction she used. The two words are closest to what you would say in your language when you mean, the one who made the ground feel different under my feet. I said, right. He handed the notebook back. He did not say anything else. He was a precise man, and he had said the precise thing, and there was nothing to add to it. I said, thank you. He nodded and went back to the records room. I stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the notebook page, and then I folded it and put it in my coat pocket alongside the flat stone. I went back to my quarters that evening. The flat stone was on the table. It was where I had put it on the evening of the day she had given it to me. When I had come home and turned it over in my hands for a while and then set it down carefully with the bird van side facing up. I had moved it a few times since to the windowsill one week when the morning light came through at an angle that caught the vane differently. Back to the table when I wanted it closer. It was the most traveled object on the table, which is saying something, because the table was where everything I considered important eventually ended up. I sat down. I put the notebook next to the stone, open to the page where I had copied the two words. I looked at them for a while. The one who showed you. The one who made the ground feel different under my feet. My mother had believed, firmly and without much patience for argument, that there were certain things a person needed to know how to do if they were going to move through the world without being entirely at its mercy. Reading a compass, preparing food from raw materials, speaking please and thank you in the languages of people around you, moving your feet with intention. She had not ranked these. She considered them all equally foundational, in the way that a house's foundations are equally foundational. You do not say the southeast corner of the foundation is more important than the northwest corner. They hold the thing together as a system, and removing any one of them changes the integrity of the whole. She had been a systematic person in this regard, and she had transmitted the system to me the way she did everything else, directly, without ceremony, with the expectation that I would do the work and the knowledge would follow. I had been 12 years old, learning the fjord step on a wooden dock on the coast of a gray northern sea, on a morning that was cold in the way of Norwegian autumn mornings, not severely cold, but with the cold of a season beginning to mean it. She had held both her forearms out and told me to grip them and feel the weight shift before I tried to do it with my own legs. And I had felt it, the commitment forward, the hold, the recovery, the way the body has to trust the recovery even when instinct says to stop moving. She had said feel it first, then do it, and I had. I had not thought, on that morning, that this would travel. I had not thought about where it would go or what it would become or who else's legs it would eventually pass through. I had been 12 and cold and trying not to embarrass myself on a dock in front of my mother, which is the full extent of what I had been thinking about. It had traveled anyway. It had traveled the way things travel when they are put into a person's body rather than into their head across 40 years, across several star systems, across the gap between two species who do not share a common language, across a gravel forecourt on a high cold plateau to a small girl in a wheeled frame on a winter afternoon when the wind had dropped and the light had gone to copper. It had arrived somewhere my mother could not have imagined. It had been received by someone she would never know existed. I sat at the table for a while longer, not tired, not restless, in the particular stillness of a person who has run their hand over something and found it solid where they expected to find it, and is taking a moment with the solidity of it before moving on. There was nothing I needed to do with the feeling. I did not need to name it or act on it or share it. It was simply there, the way the stone was there, the way the evening was there, the way the 7 years were there behind me, and the morning was there ahead. I went to bed at the usual hour. I slept well. In the morning I went back to work. The eastern garden needed its frost period maintenance. The shrubs along the east wall wanted a second pass that I had deferred from the day before because the light had gone before I could finish. The gravel path had a section near the western gate that had shifted in the freeze and needed resetting before the surface became uneven enough to cause problems for the frame's wheels. The drainage channel at the base of the east wall needed one more inspection before the deepest part of the cold season made the work inaccessible. I had my tools, I had my route, I had the flat stone in my chest pocket, where I had put it before I left the quarters, as I did every morning. Leah was in her frame when I arrived. She was in the center of the forecourt, earlier than usual, her slate across her forearms. The morning was clear and very cold, and the blue of the sky had that altitude clarity to it again. Her breath made small clouds in the air above the frame. Mine made larger ones. I said good morning in the Vethar way. She said good morning back, in the careful pronunciation she had been using with me since the early months, slightly deliberate, slightly patient. The pronunciation of a teacher who is also modeling the thing she is teaching. I went to the shrubs. I began the second pass. The work was the same as it had always been. The same cold, the same light, the same slight resistance in the frost-stiffened branches, the same clean smell of cut vegetation in cold air, the same quality of silence that the walled garden had in the mornings when everything outside it was still starting its day. After some time I heard the frame's wheels on the gravel, the specific weight and roll of it, the sound I knew as well as my own tools. She had moved herself to the end of the path near where I was working, not close, not intruding on the work, just closer than the center of the forecourt. I kept working. She did not say anything for a while. The morning proceeded the way mornings do when two people who know each other well are occupying the same space without needing to perform the occupying of it. Then she said something in Vethar, slowly, in the pace she used when she wanted me to keep up rather than the pace she used when she was speaking for herself. She said, "You came back." I said, "Yes." She said, "Every morning." I said, "Yes, that was the job." She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a small sound, not the professional disagreement sound, not the near amusement sound, a different one, softer. The sound of a person who has heard an answer that is not the whole answer and has decided not to press for the rest of it, because they already know the rest of it, and the knowing is enough. I finished the section of the wall I was on. I moved to the next section. The gravel path glittered in the morning light where the frost was still on it, and the silvergrass lay dormant and pale at the forecourt's edges, and the stone of the palace walls was the color of old bone in the cold, clear air. I have thought, sometimes, about what it means that I did not change my route. I do not mean this in a self-congratulatory sense. I want to be careful about that, because it is easy to take something that was largely automatic and retroactively describe it as a principled choice, and the retroactive description would not be accurate. I did not change my route because the drainage channels needed clearing, and the shrubs needed trimming, and the gravel needed raking, and these were the facts that governed my days. The soft suggestion that came through the steward was a soft suggestion, and I had enough experience with soft suggestions and hard orders to know the difference, and I treated it accordingly. But I have thought about why the automatic thing was to keep going, rather than to stop. I think about what Selorth did, and what it cost, and what it did not accomplish. He walked into a house with a child in it, and he made a remark framed as a concern, and the remark was efficient and precise, and left no record of having been made. And it worked in every way that such remarks are designed to work. It altered the staffing. It cleared the garden. It moved the relevant parties into arrangements that served his interests without anyone having to say directly that this was what was happening. Except for one thing. One groundskeeper who had a maintenance schedule and a route and a set of drainage channels that needed clearing on a specific day of the week, and who had been doing this particular job in this particular garden for 7 years. And who was not a person who had ever been successfully talked out of the plain evidence of his own eyes. He could not make me not see her. That was the thing he had not accounted for. You can redirect a household staff. You can restructure an attendant rotation. You can pass a suggestion through the right channels and watch it ripple through the entire system in a matter of days, altering behavior at every level without a single direct instruction being issued. All of that works. It is effective precisely because it does not announce itself. What it cannot do is make a person who has been showing up in the same place at the same time for 7 years not see the child who is sitting in the garden when he gets there. I have wondered sometimes whether this is a human thing specifically, or whether it is simply a person thing, and whether I am wrong to distinguish them. I do not know the answer to that. I am not qualified to assess what the Vethar are or are not able to be trained out of. I know only what I have observed from inside the particular kind of creature that I am, which is a human being. Which is a thing that has a great deal of difficulty looking at a child and deciding, for political or administrative or strategic reasons, that the child is not there. People try. I understand that they try. The pressures that produce those efforts are real pressures. The interests they serve are real interests. I am not dismissing the machinery of it. I am simply saying that, in my experience, the machinery tends to run into a problem when it encounters a person who has been showing up in the same place at the same time for 7 years and who cannot convincingly pretend that the garden is empty. Selorth tried. The machinery was efficient. It worked everywhere it was supposed to work. It did not work in the Eastern Garden. My mother died before I left Earth. She had been a small woman from a coastal town who lived a long life and ended it at home in the winter, in the way she had always said she wanted to end it quietly, in her own bed, with the sound of the water outside. She did not know that I would eventually sign a labor transit contract and spend 22 years on extraction sites and then 7 years on the private estate of an alien noble house on a high cold plateau above an atmosphere that breathed differently from the atmosphere she had raised me in. She had given me what she gave me without knowing where it would go. That is the only way it works, I think. You cannot transmit something with full knowledge of its destination, because the destination is in the future, and the future is not a place you can know precisely. You can only put the thing into the person standing in front of you, as carefully and completely as you can, and trust that the person will carry it somewhere. She had put the fjord step into my legs on a cold dock on a gray morning, and my legs had carried it across 40 years and several star systems and one cold-walled garden on a high plateau, and it had found its way into a small girl in a wheeled frame, and she had felt the rhythm of it pass through the contact, and she had stopped anticipating the next step and started moving, and she had called me afterward the one who made the ground feel different under her feet. My mother would not have predicted any of that. She would not have needed to. She would have recognized it anyway, I think, not the specifics, the alien setting. The alien child, the planet she had never seen and never would see, but the shape of it, the way a thing put into a person travels, unexpectedly, into places that were unforeseeable and sometimes extraordinary, and arrives there intact. I think she would have found that satisfying. She was a person who was satisfied by systems that worked, by things that held up under the weight you put on them. I kept my route. The Eastern Garden needed its daily maintenance, and I maintained it. The cold season ran its course and gave way to the early warming months, and the silver grass came up again from dormancy in the pale green of its first growth, and the ornamental shrubs put out new growth that needed the first thinning of the warm season, and the drainage channels needed their spring clearing after the snowmelt worked through the estate's upper levels and down into the lower terrace walls. I worked through all of it, on the same schedule, at the same hours, in the same order. The route was the route. The work was the work. Leah was in her frame on most mornings when I arrived, though not every morning. Those mornings were fine too. The garden was the same garden either way. The work was the same work. But on the mornings when she was there, the quality of the garden was what it had been since the beginning: occupied, inhabited, a space being used by someone who knew how to use it. The drawings on the slate changed over the months. New subjects, new problems being worked through. The ongoing revision of the bird in flight, which she had still not declared finished. The stones in the tray were reorganized periodically, the categories maintained, but the individual assignments reconsidered as new specimens were found and the existing ones were seen differently against new comparisons. I showed her things, when there were things worth showing. The correct approach for the warm season shrub thinning, the way the drainage channels behaved differently in snowmelt runoff versus rain runoff, and what that meant for the clearing schedule. The specific set of conditions: soil temperature, moisture level, air temperature that told you the silver grass was far enough out of dormancy to take its first maintenance of the season without damage. She paid attention to all of it, filed it away, asked, occasionally, in her careful Vethar, why, the good kind of why, the kind that is asking about the principle rather than the instruction. I answered as best I could, in my slower but increasingly functional Vethar, and she evaluated the answers with the expression of professional assessment, and sometimes told me I was wrong about a thing, and sometimes allowed that I was right. On those mornings, the Eastern Garden was, as it had always been, its own place. The high, cold sky above it, the pale palace stone at its edges, the silver grass and the ornamental shrubs and the gravel path, and the drainage channels that ran clean when they were properly maintained and caused problems when they were not. The same ground I had been working for 7 years. The same route, the same tools. The ground that was different now, under my feet. Not because the ground had changed, but because of what had happened on it. I had not gone looking for any of it. I had come to work in the morning and kept my route and showed up, which was all the job required. And somewhere in the ordinary middle of that, the ground had shifted. Not for me. Exactly, I am a groundskeeper. Shifting ground is my business, and I have long since stopped being surprised when it moves. But for someone small in a frame on a high cold plateau, someone whose name meant the one who waits, who had been waiting for someone to simply keep coming back for her, I think, the ground had shifted considerably. That is the thing I carry when I carry the stone. Not pride, not satisfaction in the neat sense of a problem solved or a task completed. Something quieter than that and more durable. The particular weight of knowing that you showed up. And the showing up was the right amount of the right thing at the right time. And you could not have known that when you were doing it, which means it was not strategy or heroism or wisdom, but something simpler. You looked up. She was there. You kept coming back. That was the whole of it. The next morning, I went to work. The eastern garden needed its shrubs trimmed and its drainage cleared and its gravel raked. And I was the groundskeeper, and that was the job. And I did it. Leah was in her frame when I arrived. I said good morning in the Vethar way. She said good morning back. The morning came in over the ridge in the way it always came, deep red going to amber, going to pale gold, and the silvergrass turned silver in the first wind of the day. And the palace stone caught the light and held it, and I got to work. The flat stone with the bird vein is still in my chest pocket. I have carried it every day for 2.5 years. I have not decided to stop.